it is my extreme pleasure to introduce Kejua Sanders McMurtry to you now. I'm going to say just a few comments about her before I pass it over to her. So Kejua serves as the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Mount Holyoke College. She grew up in an activist household where conversations around advocacy and activism were prevalent. She learned from her father the importance of standing up when things did not seem fair and equitable. Kejua has an insatiable appetite for reading and learning, which is why she's wonderful in what she does. And she attributes this love of knowledge to her mother, who encouraged her to read at an extremely young age. Kejua's lived experience informs both her work and her passion, going from a high school dropout to PhD, with steps along the way to earn her associate's, her bachelor's, and her master's degrees. While this is an introduction to Kejua, it will not be the last you're hearing from her. So I would like to share just a couple of her accomplishments, and you'll be able to read more in the link that we're providing. I mentioned her role at Mount Holyoke as the VP for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. Well, she was the inaugural vice president within that role. And because of her talents, under her leadership, Mount Holyoke received the 2021 Higher Education Excellence in Diversity from Diversity in Education. In a prior capacity, she worked at Agnes Scott College, which is a women's college, and she led the creation and implementation of a trans inclusion policy that allowed Agnes Scott to be inclusive to the trans community and retain its single gender status. This was the first policy of its kind to be instituted in the country. And she served in many other capacities, including as the co-chair for the trans inclusion with NASPA, the National Association of Student Personnel and Administrators. So Kejua is going to lead a panel conversation with a number of our Complete College America fellows, of which Kejua is also a part. And we chose these folks to have this candid conversation because these CCA fellows all center equity in their work and what they do every day. So I will now turn it over to Kejua to introduce the panel and get us started. Thank you, Kejua.
Thank you so much, Brandon. It's always interesting to hear your bio, right? So we have such a distinguished panel, and I'm going to be asking them to introduce themselves, and we will also be putting in the chat their bios as well. So again, I'm Kejua. I use she, they pronouns, and I think I want to begin by making sure that the panelists can both introduce themselves but also share their perspectives on equity. We are so excited to be kicking this off and getting to know you all as equity leads over the time that you will be serving and supporting in your role. And we want to be honestly as available and accessible and as informative as we can be to you all. So welcome again. I think we talked about an order, but I don't know that we actually did. So I'm going to actually start with our panelists. Lenore, if you could introduce yourself. And the first question we really wanted to explore and reflect upon, and we'll be conversational. We want this to be like a fireside chat. The first question that we wanted to consider was, having us talk about what equity means to us and how equity has informed our own career trajectory, because we know we have folks who are maybe at various different points in engaging in equity work and may feel as though, they need to be sort of at the top of a hierarchy to make change. And this is not the case. So we're united for change today during this Complete College America week. So I'd like to invite Lenore. And after Lenore, we'll be hearing from another incredible CCA fellow in just a moment. So Lenore, please start us off.
Thank you so much, Kejua. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Lenore Tolicio. It is a pleasure to be joining all of you today. So my official titles, I currently work as a higher education strategist and am a senior fellow with the Aspen Institute's College Excellence Program, in addition to serving as a CCA fellow. You can look at my bio and see the rest of my history, but I thought I would focus a little bit more on my own personal history, because I think that has had a huge impact on the way that I view equity and the work that I do in the higher education sector around equity. So I am a first generation Cuban American, and as a Latina have grown up here in the Miami community, where I still live and reside with my own family. Growing up, there was always this expectation from my family that I would be going to college. There was never another option. And so they did everything in their power to make sure that that did occur. So I was the first in my family to attend college, but I wasn't the first in my family to graduate. I actually graduated on the same day with my father, who had attended an information session at my university with me, picked up a brochure on the adult learning program at the university I attended, enrolled with me, and we graduated on the same day. So I always tell that story because I think that helps to center equity. When we talk about equity in the higher education landscape, we're really talking about what each and every student that we encounter needs in order to be successful. You know, for many years, higher education has taken the standpoint that a student is successful depending on the effort that he or she puts into the work that they do in higher education. And I think what we've come to realize over the last few years, particularly in the last 2 years, is that that shift in the lens with which we view equity has to change. And we not only have to look at the students' actions, but we need to look at our own at higher education institutions and understand what are the barriers that we have either intentionally or unintentionally put in the path of students. And then on the flip side of that, what additional supports can we put in so that students have every opportunity to be successful? And so when I look back on my own journey, for me and for my family, those supports became things like scholarship programs. In my father's case, it became policies around credit for work-based experience. And so those life lessons, that work that I saw as I went through the experience together with my father have helped shape my view of equity and the work that I do today to try and make sure that the institutions I work with are all focused on helping the individual student, because that at the end of the day is what equity is about.
Thank you, Lenore. I'm going to ask Vistas to introduce himself next, and then we'll welcome Michael.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and I think, at least speaking for myself, I'm going to learn a lot more from the audience than you are going to learn from me, because you bring such a wealth of, it's a knowledge and it's a diversity in terms of your jobs and the people that you actually serve. So my name is Vistas Karbhari. I'm currently serving as a faculty member in the Department of Civil Engineering and the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the University of Texas at Arlington, where I served as president from 2013 to 2020. That gives me a unique sort of perspective. I was a faculty member first where I complained about a lot of things. I became an administrator, tried to fix a lot of things, and then I came back as a faculty member to find that a lot of things that I thought I'd fixed, I actually hadn't fixed, and maybe I had made a little more difficult in certain cases. And I think that's the perspective that I bring to the discussion today. When I look at my background, I came from India. I did my bachelor's and my master's in India. I worked and then came here to do my PhD. And so obviously I bring the perspective of an international student, but there were so many things that I took for granted in my life. For example, just like Lenore, by the time I went to high school, it was very clear that I was going to college. There was nothing that my parents would not do for me to go to college. And so when I finished my college and I started working, there was nothing that they wouldn't do for me to get my PhD. In fact, that was taken as a given that I was going to do that. So I come to the United States and I start, let's say, dating a person who's now my wife. And we were students at the same time. And she recounted to me something that has always stuck in my mind, and that has always guided to the way I look at things and the lens with which I look at it. Because she used to come to me and say, you had it so easy because you could go to your parents and say, I can't do this, and they'd help you. Whereas she had a time when she was in her second year and she was doing calculus. And I assume something went wrong, and she went to her mother and said, can you help me? And her mother very frankly told her, look, you're at a point far more than I have been. You need to do this by yourself. And that scared her. I think that's the lens with which we need to look at our students. We're so focused in certain areas on access that we forget about the opportunity for success. And we have to look at each student in terms of personalizing their journey based on the background that they bring. It's our responsibility, not theirs. So when I look at equity, it really looks at how we look at access and what we need to reassess and maybe even abandon rules and regulations and definitions that prevent the resources and opportunities from reaching those that need it the most. We have to differentiate between equality and equity, and the two are not the same. For example, we put a lot of people at the table, but if we don't give them an opportunity to speak and an opportunity to actually do something, then that's only things that we do in words. So when I talk about equity and the lens with which I look at equity and the experience I bring, it's really from that point of view that we not only have to provide the opportunity, but we have to assist. And I'll give one small example just to bring the point home. We all have heard the word, it's a remediation. Remediation generally assumes that someone did not do something or did something wrong. Therefore, they have to be corrected. What we forget is 9 times out of 10, it is not because of what the person didn't do, it's because of what the person didn't get. The opportunity to have a great faculty member, the opportunity to have the resources that made them good in calculus or math or in English or something else. So for me, the equity is equity of access and equity of inclusion. And we talk about diversity. To me, diversity is a vision that has to be enabled through equity and action as a path to inclusion. So all those things come together.
Thank you so much, Visa. So I can't wait to get in conversation about those last points you just made. I'd love to welcome Michael now to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his journey towards understanding equity. So Michael, if you could join us.
Certainly good to be with everyone today, and I'm so proud of Complete College America for bringing us together. I think about the work from the perspective of a practitioner president. In addition to being the president of Rockland Community College in the State University of New York system, I'm also a professor in our School of Business and Professional Studies. So I have the opportunity to work with our students as I'm helping them to navigate the decisions that they have to make as they chart the path for their own future. I think about how truly fortunate I am to be able to teach them, and I teach night classes, to be able to teach them knowing that many of them are raising families or taking care of parents or trying to just make ends meet while they try to create the pathway for the opportunities that they want. And I think about my own father. My parents went to college. My father was a student at Queensborough Community College. And then when they became pregnant with me, my dad had to make a choice. Should I continue my educational studies or should I go and work to try to make sure that I could take care of my family? He chose to do the latter. Today, because of our efforts, we have so many opportunities to say to those students who find themselves in that same situation, you can have both. And we can be the institutions that make sure that you have both. And so my father is today very proud. He was able to sit in the audience as his son became president of a community college where he could open the doors of opportunities for folks just like us. And so I am so proud to be working with Complete College America and all of the efforts around the country to say that we are not our best unless we all have the opportunity to access in the opportunity ecosystem.
This is wonderful. I'm so inspired by all 3 of you. I can't even begin to tell you. And people may notice that I'm not using your official titles, and because we actually do want this to be something where people feel like very invited into the space. Obviously, we could all tell you, the struggles we went through as PhD students and as administrators, and probably that would be relevant to the conversation. But what we wanted to also think about was just how we each have come to understand equity. And I think we've each talked about it well. So I'm going to move us to our next question, but I want to hold in the next question that I ask sort of that what you heard from each person's story, because each person told a story, right, about how their familial connections how the people that maybe mentored them on the way, or the ways that they've learned to support and mentor other people, have also informed how they see equity. And often I think when I meet people, they're like, I'm not sure how I to see equity or to want to define equity. And to be an equity lead, it really is about what you get your exposure to. So I want us to think about our resources, our strategies, our networks, and how those have informed our praxis and our pedagogy. So I'm going to actually go as in reverse order and ask each of us to weigh in on that piece. So the official question is, what resources and strategies for you have worked in terms of advancing equity in your current role? And of course, if you want to reflect on a past role, please do so. So Michael, could you start us off, and then maybe we could go in the exact reverse order. And of course, we can each talk with each other as well. So I'll ask Michael to start that. So what are important resources and strategies you want to lift up and amplify?
Well, I think from my point of view, the power of the people is really the resource that we lift up. In my case, we've done two very specific things to engage our folks in the work of equity reform at our campus. Number one, we've worked hard to look at our employee experience and to really understand its component parts. If we really want a more diversified employment base, what does the candidacy phase of that look like? What does the first year experience look like for a new employee? How are we making sure that we provide professional development plans for employees so that particularly those who have not often been able to move up the ranks, particularly those from minoritized communities, what are we going to do to be intentional about ensuring that people have the opportunity to see themselves belonging within the context of our institutions? And then, of course, how do we make sure that they are successful? So we did that with the employee experience. With the student experience, we look at the discrete areas in the student experience: connection, the time, how are we reaching out to them? What is that first year experience like? How are they getting through those gateway courses? What academic programs are they getting on? Are they getting on programs that are going to be bridges to nowhere? Are we diversifying the programs and making sure that people that don't ordinarily get access to programs that have high opportunity, to make sure that they get those access points? So through our Steps Beyond Statements work, we have commissioned campus-wide communities to really focus on the discrete parts of the student experience, the systems connected to those parts that are currently allowing systematic racism to continue. And how do we influence and in some instance dismantle the aspects of the system that make equitable outcomes frustrated? And so these are the things that I think are very, very important. And from my vantage point, creating the conditions where people can work together to attack these very difficult issues is something that I think is extraordinarily important.
Michael brings up some very, very good points in terms of the ecosystem that needs to be developed. So while he's talked about staff, let me take it a little bit onto the student side. And I'll talk about it from two different aspects to try to bring it together. When I first came to the University of Texas at Arlington, we found that we had a large number of students in the local school districts, the independent school districts, who were doing extremely well, but who did not go on to college after the 10th grade. They actually dropped out. So when we looked at it, we found out we were not doing a good enough job in two areas. We were not telling them that it was actually affordable, because what they saw was the sticker price. And if you have first generation students, they don't have that experience that we have of looking at it and saying, okay, that's not what we're going to pay. You're actually going to pay far less. The other thing that we did was we weren't working with the families in order to make that transition. And so I'll give you the example to try to sort of explain where the equity part comes in. So we started a program known as Bound for Success with 3 of our independent school districts. What it basically was that if you were in the top 25% of your graduating class in the 10th grade, you were sent a letter by the superintendent and by me that said you were admitted to the University of Texas at Arlington as long as you finished, say, high school. Now, that might have seemed a huge jump, but really what it did was it cleared the path for those who felt that they would not make it through. It cleared the path for women, for example, who were told by their families that this is all that you needed. You needed a 10th grade education and not more than that. It let them take that piece of paper, What we were doing was enabling. We were giving encouragement, and we were then making it possible by putting a counselor in each of those schools, not so much to talk about a college-going culture, but to talk to parents, to talk to them about what we need in order to make ourselves more welcoming to those students. It wasn't that we wanted to just grab the students, we wanted to assure them that they were going to be successful and we would have the resources for them to be successful. And the numbers went up dramatically, not just for our university, but all the universities around, because what we were providing was not just access, but the encouragement and the opportunity that made it possible for that ecosystem to be built around it. The second part that we have to talk about equity, and this is where four-year universities, especially R1 universities, need to really look at themselves in the mirror. We have a large number of transfer students, wonderful students who come from, let's say, community colleges, and they come for a variety of reasons. The last one of which is that because they did not get good grades. But the general tendency that we have is to assume that someone goes to a community college because their grades are not good. We talk about access, but then everything we do once they come here is based on the fact that we have something built into our minds that does not actually hold true. If you do an actual study, and so many studies have been done, yes, there is a drop in grade in the first semester. But if you look at anyone who comes straight from high school, there's a drop in grade because they're taking that jump, the leap from high school to a four-year university. The same thing happens again. But after that, if you look at it, the grades actually even out, and you will actually find that the grades of community college students are equal, if not better, than those of our natural freshmen once you come to the third and fourth year, because they are more motivated. But the support systems that they need are significantly different from the support systems that are needed for our freshmen. We can't just assume that they're here, sink or swim. And that's one of the first things we have to talk about when we look at equity. Equity does not mean bringing a person in and saying, here you are, sink or swim. We have to provide the wraparound services. We have to provide the support so that the resources that they did not have for no fault of their own are provided to them to make them successful. And I hope that gives you a little bit of an example as to things that we need to do and the experiences that we bring to the table, small little things that could make a huge change.
Thank you, Vistas. I would love to hear, Lenore, your thoughts on this question.
So much, and I'll pick up where Vistas just left off. You know, a lot of times we think that the terms academic rigor and sink or swim are synonymous, and they are not. The majority of our students can be successful in whatever course we place them in at our institutions, if only we provide the necessary supports that will ensure that they are successful, that they have the tools in hand to be able to meet those academic standards that we set forth. The challenge, though, is that when we talk about equity, the history that has brought us to where we are today is a history of systemic challenges. There are barriers that have been put in place throughout our institutions. There are policies and practices that have built up over time. And when we try to change them, the first thing that we usually encounter is this cultural reaction of, but that's the way we've always done it. And that is precisely the challenge, that we continue to do things the way that we've always done them. And so because this is a systemic problem, it requires a systemic response. It requires us to not try to put bandages on certain areas of the institution or to look only at certain departments, but it really requires us to look at our higher education institutions, to look at our higher education systems from that systems perspective. How do we change our hiring practices to begin to align the individuals that are at our institutions serving our students to this equity mindset that we're setting forth for our institution? How do we recruit students in a more equitable fashion than what we've traditionally done? How do we provide them those resources so that they see that college is not only accessible, but attainable, and that they can be successful? And then provide them with the right wraparound supports, as Vistas and Michael have already explained, in order for them to be successful. But again, it takes this bird's eye perspective to be able to drill down to every aspect of the institution to make sure that we're looking at all of our practices and policies from that equity lens. It can't just be something that we try to piecemeal in a department here and there. It can't just be a pilot program. We cannot fall into the trap that I hear at so many of the institutions that I work with, that it's the responsibility of the DEI officer, because it's everyone's responsibility at the institution. We all have to work together to bring about the change.
First of all, I'm so bowled over by all of your answers, and I'm taking copious notes myself. It's been incredible to hear you. And we're going to open the floor for questions from the equity leads in just a moment. But I want to pick up on a thread that each of you sort of talked about. So, you're challenging the notion of sort of the sink or swim. You're talking about system issues that we need to correct and even disrupt. And I think it fits so beautifully into the theme of Complete College America this week related to this, right? There was a focus on thinking about how inequity and injustice are things that CCA in particular is working across the nation to disrupt. And it reminded me of something I heard Claude Steele say, who is a well-known social psychologist that studies stereotype threat. He said that institutions are often incubators of inequality. And so I want to just sit with that when I think about what you all have talked about. We have equity leads on the call. And so I'm going to ask anyone to kind of, volunteer to respond to the next question first. We can kind of go to organic format here. But as you think about giving advice to folks who have, because they're evidenced by their presence here, invested in trying to think about equity and challenging inequity and injustice and the systems that are failing our students, what would be your advice, regardless of their role and their where they are in the hierarchy of the institution they're in? What would be your advice to them? Would love to hear your thoughts. So who would like to, I don't want you to necessarily have to wave. I guess it'd be better maybe if I pick.
I'll wave.
Okay, maybe I'll move. Okay, go ahead, V-Stop. So you start. I want to give people time to sit with the question again, but you start and then maybe we
So
can.
two things. One is rather radical, at least it might seem radical to a lot of people. For every rule, every process, every procedure that we have, question it. Generically, we have those procedures in place because of something that was set more than a century ago. Our demographics are no longer the same. The reason that people go to college are no longer the same. And therefore, we need to look at the processes that we had at that point in time that might have seemed to make a lot of sense. Some of them were horrible at that point in time, but some of them just seemed to make a lot of sense because that's the way it was done. Look at each one of them from the lens of the student who is trying to come to a university or to a college. Look at it from the lens of the faculty member or the staff member who's trying to work and figure out, does that actually apply today? And does it help them do what they're trying to do to reach a better stage in life? That's the first part. The second part is to personalize. We've always said that personalization is not possible within a university for students because you can't do different things for different people. And yet over the last 18 months, we've proven that when we wanted to and we had to, we could, and we did it very well. Personalization to take into account the background that everyone brings to the university, some because of choices they've made and some because that was their lot in life. That needs to be looked at. And if we can just look at those two things and look at it through those lenses, we'd actually make a huge difference in terms of equity and inclusion in the future.
So in giving advice to the equity partners that are on the line, I would preface my advice with a warning. And the warning is, and I hope I don't have to say this, but this is hard work. This is not easy work. As I said before, this is something that has built up over time. It is a systemic problem. And so it requires this large scale solution. Change is not going to occur overnight. It's going to take time. And so if you launch into this work, you need to know that you are going to be in this work for the long haul, and that there are going to be many battles that you lose in this war, but you always need to stay on top of it and continue the work. That said, it's important for those of you that are either college leaders or aspiring college leaders to also know that you can't go at this work on your own. You need to have a support network around you to help you in this work. You need to be able to call on leaders of color, on minoritized populations within your campus community, be that students, faculty, or staff, to help provide you with insight on what their experience is, so that as you craft solutions, you are crafting the solutions that are going to support those for whom you are trying to build this more equitable system. You also need to rely on organizations like Complete College America and so many other partners that we work with in helping to provide you with the tools that you need to be able to do this work. There are so many nuances to the work that we do, especially when we look at specific populations, when we try to look at the supports that we need, when we try to figure out the approach that we need to redesign our systems. And so rather than try and reinvent the wheel across our institutions, trying to learn from best practices and what has and has not worked at other institutions is key. So, to just sum up that advice, it's hard work. It's a long game. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but know that that support network that you build around yourself of individuals that you can bounce ideas off of and organizations that you can rely on to help you sift through your data and potential solutions is going to be critical in order to advance this work at your institutions.
I love the advice of my colleagues. They're spot on. I would just say this: don't think that you can buy a book. Don't think that you can have a speaker and then all of a sudden you don't have no more equity problems. Don't think that you can look at what somebody else is doing and then decide that's the way for you to go. Don't think that you know where your institution is, because in fact, everybody may not be at the same place. So if your institution is not ready to claim and hold firm to being an anti-racist institution, and that's what is the first thing out the gate, you might frustrate the ability of your institution to move forward and to specifically address the issues that you face. You have to understand where your institution is in their equity awareness and move them along that continuum. And there are specific ways that you can move your institution along the continuum. And you cannot simply focus on students, because that is comfortable. It's like saying, let's just focus on diversity, because that's comfortable. You have to be able to understand that the challenges are with the employee experience as well. The fact is, too many students of color specifically, or marginalized students specifically, can go their whole academic program not having any faculty member that looks like them. And you have to be able to understand in this institution why that's a problem and what you're going to do about it. And so it's not enough to make great statements. We have wonderful people that write beautiful statements and all these kind of things, and that's fantastic. That shows how eloquent you are, how poetic you can be. It doesn't show how committed you are. If we are not setting specific targets, if we're not understanding where we are in our equity awareness as an institution, and we're not being very mindful and thoughtful and actually goal-oriented about how we want to move our institution forward, we can sound good all we want, but we will not make progress. And at the end of the day, as was mentioned, where we are in this country didn't just start now. And so where we need to go is going to take time, but it can't wait forever. And if it's going to happen, it has to be us.
Thank you so much. So we have questions from the audience, and we have about 10 minutes. We're going to end right at 2:45, just to remind folks. So, because I know you're enjoying a rich day of programming, we want to give you that transition time. And these are very, very busy folks on this panel. I'm so grateful to my fellow CCA fellows. We all came in together. So the questions are really great. I'll ask this first one. As equity leads with the CCA Alliance, what can we do if we do not necessarily have positional authority to guide equity work in our state? And I might actually start off by answering this just a little bit, just because I happen to be a person whose equity is in my title. And I find that people often feel as though, and I love what Lenore said, so I'm just going to say that the vice president for equity, or the equity person, is the person. But we all know that for equity to really work, for us to do the systemic change that is needed, It really does require all of us to be thinking really critically about how in each meeting we're in or each situation we're in, we have a person who might speak to equity, even if it's not in our title or in our role or in our job. So I would say, really, I really feel very strongly that it really doesn't matter what position you're in or where you are at every level of the institution. You can, in a meeting, be not, I don't mean disruptive in a way that's disrespectful, but you can actually ask those interrogative questions or problematize an issue and ensure that the lens that you're bringing is one of equity.
I'll just add to what Kajua said. I think all of us can impact equity from the seat in which we currently reside. And so whether you are an administrative assistant in a department or a faculty member or an advisor, there is always something that you can do within the role you currently have that will advance equity at your institution. And that can be as simple as supporting the individual student or students that you have in front of you, to having conversations with your supervisors about inequities that you see and potential solutions to help move them forward. So it's always looking at, in the role that I have today, what is the change that I can affect in my institution from where I sit? And if I can't make the change, who can I talk to that can make that change?
One of the other things that I would encourage people to do is hold people accountable to what they say. So you have mission statements, you have vision statements, you have value statements, you have different, proclamations that are made by boards. And those often have these language about social justice or inclusion or respect and all this kind of stuff. And all that sounds good. But when you see that there are things that are happening that are in conflict with the values, in conflict with the mission, in conflict with the ethos of your organization, use the language that has been agreed to and adopted and accepted as who we are supposed to be, and ask the critical question: does our behavior reflect that which we've said about ourselves?
I think that's very, very important, as is the fact that we should be asking questions. Everyone should be asking questions when they see something. Why is it that we do something today the way we do it? What we find so often is we don't know. We've always done it that way. Or we assume that there is a rule or regulation. When you look into it, there is no rule or regulation. It's just something assumed. Ask the question. And if you don't get an answer, ask the question again. Start going slightly higher, be polite, but go slightly higher to ask the same question. And you will actually find that 9 times out of 10, people will come and say, oh, I didn't know. And if it can make a change and make a difference, why not? And you will have started and catalyzed a movement that actually would not have happened otherwise.
Thank you. So this actually is a great connection to the next question. The next question says, what would you say to someone who is sitting on the fence as it relates to standing up for equity? They want to do or say something, but are concerned about the consequences of being vocal. And I'm going to, one more time, really add to this one. I think what's interesting is these officer roles of like equity, chief diversity officer, vice president, really have evolved over time. And I had no aspiration to be a chief diversity officer. Right? It didn't exist as a position when I started out in higher education, but because I started to be vocal in spaces as this job was created, I was tapped several times to move into the role. And I want to give a quick anecdote that I heard, and I know there's some excellent case studies that you all might be able to give examples of, so I welcome those. I was in a meeting where the Claude Stills statement had been said, and a provost was in that meeting, and he said, I found out about a policy that many people knew was actually creating an inequitable system, which is that students at my institution were encouraged to go do research and travel, but they had to pay up front and get reimbursed. So there were many students, first generation students maybe who were, which doesn't always mean they're low income, but in this case, there were some students who were low income who he just thought were no longer interested in the opportunities because he didn't know this policy existed, where they had to pay out of pocket $1,000 for conference travel and get reimbursed. And when he found out, he went to different people and said, why does this policy exist? And they said, we don't know, We've always thought it was unfair, but we didn't think we had the power to change it. I'm sure all of us have anecdotes like that one. So it was really about people being afraid to say, this policy doesn't seem just to students or equitable to students. What are people's thoughts about that? And we probably have maybe a few minutes and we'll take the last question before we jump off. But anybody want to give insights on that one? Maybe we don't all have to weigh in, but it's up to you all. Who wants to share?
Sometimes it's not that we are, sometimes we're just not knowledgeable because it doesn't impact us. It doesn't affect us. It's not my issue, so I'm not thinking about it. And so to the extent that regardless of your position, you can make people aware of the things that they are not top of mind for them. That is a help. You have the ability to be a resource, and you've got to be able to use your influence to be able to show that the relationships that you have can serve this greater purpose.
You know, we're not afraid if we see a crime being committed out in the street to see if you see something, you say something. And I think the same thing applies when we see inequity on our campuses. You know, we might not think that it has the same effect as if we see someone attempting a murder out on the street. But if you think about it, if a student is unable to be successful at our institutions, it could be the difference between that student and his or her family living in poverty or not. And so if you think about it from that perspective, then you see that this is almost a life-saving action that you're taking by speaking up on inequities that you see.
So there's another question. If you want to take any of the questions I've asked and add to them, you can. Let's take the question, how do we identify allies, some tips on identifying allies, champions at the institution or the system to undergo this work. So people are trying to figure out who to connect with at their institution so that they don't probably feel alone and isolated. So how do you identify folks? Any tips?
So the first thing I can say is look to your students. Our students are extremely good at identifying faculty members and staff who hear them out. They don't necessarily change everything for them, but they hear them out and see what can be done in order to change the ecosystem and help. Look for those people. Talk to the students, find out from the students, and you found your champions, you found your allies, because these are naturally the people within our system who for years have already been doing the right thing and have already been making changes unseen, unheard, let's say unsupported, but making tremendous changes. Those would be the persons that I'd look for almost immediately.
Create the opportunities. If you don't ask people their opinion, if you don't offer opportunities for folks to enter the conversation, if you are not going to be willing to step out, you can't expect anybody else to step out either.
If you are in a position to affect change at your institution, then you should look at your human resources policy so that you get to a point where everybody at your institution is an ally in this work. And that's the way that we're going to get to true change, is really making sure that the folks that we've got surrounding our students are the individuals who are going to help support them.
This panel has been wonderful. I can't thank you enough. You are amazing. I'm so honored to be able to do this with you and work with you. I want to thank the Equity Leads for being here. I want to thank Complete College America for putting together this panel, this incredible week, and for the work that you do every single day, the entire team behind the scenes and in front of the camera, making sure this happens. So the Complete College America Fellows, I hope you have a wonderful day. I know you have very busy lives, and we're so grateful for the time. And I hope as Equity Leads, those of you that are out there, that you listen to this panel or engage with this panel and reach out to us, but also continue the work you're doing. We need you so much. The students need you so much. Our world needs you so much. So thank you. Have a wonderful day.